Welcome back to Hey Kentucky. Now, we are very happy to be joined by Jerry Buting. He says Jerome on the book, who's written Illusion of Justice, but you probably know him as one of the two attorneys from the Making a Murderer case on Netflix. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Good to be here.
I appreciate it. You know, as a former attorney, I was fascinated by that case and all the ramifications of it. People who watched it know the Steven Avery, the basics, but basically, you, throughout the course of that case, saw, how would you describe the Steven Avery case in terms of miscarriage of justice? Is that how you would feel?
I would say miscarriage of justice, but sadly not alone in this country. You know, in a lot of ways, the case captures, you know, there are people who teach it at law schools now, an entire semester-wide course, because it has so many different elements in it of legal issues, you know, media issues, high publicity that may have, you know, tainted the jury beforehand. You know, police corruption allegations. So you know, it's really, in some ways, it's remarkable because Steven Avery is thankfully the only DNA exoneree who spent time in prison and was, you know, wrongly convicted, released, and then later is charged and convicted with something so serious as a homicide. So in that aspect, it's unique, but in other ways, it's not.
See, I actually think that's the most interesting part to me is sort of its non-uniqueness, in the sense of all the various things from the tainting of evidence to potential police misconduct, et cetera. There are a lot of strands that come throughout, including false confessions. I mean, I think part of what made that case so interesting is it opened the eyes of the world to a system you were used to, but most people maybe were not.
That's right. And, you know, I've said that our courthouses are really like black boxes, that people don't really know what goes on in those courthouses other than the inside people that know how to play the game, lawyers, prosecutors, judges. When I first started practicing law a long time ago, we used to have what we called court watchers. So we were retired people mostly who would come in and just sit and watch trials. No connection at all to the families or the...
Just to enjoy it.
Just to enjoy it, you know, just to, and it also, I would see that the judges, you know, if they knew that there was somebody there watching them, might be on a little bit better behavior. So you don't see that anymore. And people really don't have any idea what happens in court other than the portrayal that Hollywood gives it, which has never been realistic. The nice thing about this documentary is that people actually see what happens in court. They hear from the real witnesses, the lawyers. You know, you see what they said, how they said it, and that gives people an insight in their criminal justice system. And by and large, it didn't come off looking very well.
Do you think, this is sort of a broad question, but do you think the criminal justice system is fair?
No, I don't. I don't think it's impossible to get a fair trial. There are some fair trials, but the system as a whole is really broken. That's what I talk about in my book. And it's been on a long slide for a number of decades, and it's going to take a long time to correct some of the problems that this system has, whether it's racial, socioeconomic class. You know, poor people lose. Poor people lose most of the time, is what Steven Avery says in Making a Murderer, and unfortunately it's true. So, you know, I don't think it's what people expect in their courthouses. After Making a Murderer came out globally, immediately Dean and I were contacted from people all over the world that were saying, how could this be? This is supposed to be America, you know, the shining city on a hill that's supposed to give an example to the world of fairness. And they certainly didn't see it here, and sadly, you know, that's why I call my book The Illusion of Justice. Too much of justice that happens is really an illusion. It's, you know, underpaid, underskilled defenders, overworked prosecutors, judges, some of whom are jaded, some of whom aren't that good. You know, some are, of course. And when you throw all this into the mix, you get a system that now is really broken and is not what I think the founders of this country had intended.
I know a lot of people who watch the documentary sort of focus on, did Steven Avery do it or not? I tended to believe, just personally, that in some ways it matters, but it doesn't matter, because even if he did do it, the trial wasn't fair. And that there's an importance of fairness regardless of the guilt or innocence, do you think most criminal justice trials in America are fair?
You know, I would say most of them probably are fair in the outcome, not necessarily when it gets to the sentencing, because if the person's convicted, then that's another whole problem in this country, is that we have a mass incarceration problem where our sentences are too long. You know, I understand how you feel, and I understand, I've heard from people who've watched the documentary who've said, you know, I'm just not so sure about Steven Avery. I don't know whether he's guilty or not. I'm not convinced he's innocent, but I don't think he got a fair trial. But Brendan Dassey, the 16-year-old nephew, on the other hand, most people who look at that interrogation session say, well, come on, how can this happen? This can't be fair.
And that, I completely agree. For people who didn't see it, the interrogation session, it's clear he is not fully there for it.
Right.
The United States Supreme Court is hearing his, whether to grant cert for his case on Thursday, am I right?
That's right, June 14th.
Do you have any, what do you think is going to happen with that?
Well, you know, it's an interesting case. It's difficult because it came to the federal court through what's called habeas corpus, and there's all kinds of additional obstacles and layered upon it before a court can decide to take it. But it's the issues that are raised. It's been a long time since the Supreme Court has really looked at the interrogation techniques that are used against juveniles. And they've said 40 years ago, juveniles are different. You know, what might overcome somebody's will who's an adult, what may not overcome somebody's will who's an adult, juveniles don't know, they don't understand their rights, and particularly when you combine someone like Brendan Dassey, who's also got mental disabilities, or limitations at least, you know, any person that looks at that interrogation session is going to say, how can this be fair? Now, the Supreme Court has not looked at the process since the advent of DNA exonerations. Back in the day, before that happened, when people would say that, you know, are there really false confessions? Who falsely confesses? You know, I wouldn't falsely confess. You probably wouldn't. And so most people, when somebody's been convicted and had confessed, they wouldn't believe them when they would recant and say, I got pressured into it. Mm-hmm. But now we know that's not true. After DNA, they did a study of the exonerations, and of the juveniles that had been convicted falsely, 43% of them had falsely confessed to crimes that DNA proved they didn't do. And why? It's because of the techniques that are used. Mm-hmm. And this is really an opportunity for the U.S. Supreme Court to step in and say, all right, we told you 40 years ago, courts, lower courts, that you need to treat juveniles differently. Here's why. This is a perfect example. And you know, they can really make a statement. So I think it's really, in some ways, an ideal case for the court to take.
Your co-counsel said during the documentary, he used the line, which a lot of people use, I hope Mr. Avery is guilty, because if he's not, this would sort of haunt me. Do you agree with that statement?
What he was trying to say is, you know, that's one of the difficulties of being a criminal defense attorney. You carry a lot of weight on your shoulders, and you do your best to try and make sure that due process is followed and that your client gets a fair trial. But it's the ones that you really believe or suspect are innocent. And when you lose those cases, you know, it is crushing. It's a burden to this day. I feel like Steven was wrongly convicted. I do believe he's innocent. And I wish there was some way that I could do something different. You second guess everything he did. You know, people sometimes say, how can you defend those people as a criminal defense attorney? If you know somebody's guilty, how can you defend them? Well, I turn it around and say, look, it's easier, frankly, to defend somebody that's probably guilty than it is somebody who's innocent.
Don't feel the same pressure?
It's not the same pressure. I mean, you try equally hard in both cases, but at least if the person is likely or probably guilty, then it's, you know, justice has been done in some respect. And then it's a question of what's the sentence that meets the, you know, what's the punishment that fits the crime. But when somebody's really innocent, and believe me, there's a lot. I mean, there's estimates of anywhere from, you know, 3 to 5 or 6% of the people in prison these days are probably innocent. And most of them don't have DNA that could prove one way or the other, because it's not like CSI, where there's physical, objective, you know, scientific evidence that can prove one way or the other guilt or innocence. And you know, when you talk about 2 million people that are imprisoned in America, that's an awful lot of people that are wrongly imprisoned.
If you could sort of get one takeaway for viewers who either have seen Making a Murderer or who haven't, that you wish that you could sort of impart and sort of a positive to come from all this, what would that be?
It would be that I hope people become more interested and stay informed about what's happening in their local courtrooms. Whether that's, you know, if you have a chance to go down and see what happens in the court at some time or another, but more likely if you get picked for jury duty. Most people view that as like, oh my God, it's like a root canal.
Yes.
How do I get out of jury duty, right?
Yeah.
I really hope people don't feel that way, because it's the only chance that you can participate in the judicial branch of our government, one of 3 co-equal branches. And until people really take ownership that this is part of your democracy, this is part of our government that our founding fathers instituted and that people have died on the battlefields to support, you know, that's what really I hope people take away from this, is that you try and participate, try and get to know who's running in the judicial election or the prosecutors or the sheriff's elections that most people don't even bother to vote in. Mm-hmm. Just take ownership in it, and if you do, then I think we have a chance to reform it and get it more like what we would want.
So, Mr. Buting will be tomorrow at the Kentucky Theater from 5:30 to 6:30. He's signing this book, Illusion of Justice, which is very interesting. And if you've watched this show, Steve Romines and I have talked about a lot of these issues. I highly recommend it. It's tomorrow at the Kentucky Theater, 5:30 to 6:30. Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
All right.
I enjoyed all your work, and good luck to you.